Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to talk about the humanistic theory of personality in a little more detail and talk about trait theory and some of the personality assessments and the personality assessment that you're going to take for your homework assignment. And so we all know what personality is. We all know that everybody has a different personality and we're all really complex as human beings. And of course the humanistic perspective, you all remember, talks about the inherent goodness of people, but the humanistic perspective also talks about self-awareness and free will. So we can become aware of personality traits that we like and don't like about ourselves, and we have free will to actually change that. So the humanists really believe that we have the potential for psychological growth and changing our personality, and that healthy personality development is definitely possible. And if we didn't have healthy personality development as a child, like Freud talked about, that doesn't mean we can't change it later on. They really believed that we can all be a fully functioning person, according to Carl Rogers, but we can all be better human beings, and we can all better ourselves by becoming more self-aware and by deliberately changing things that we want to change. So Carl Rogers is one of the major humanistic theorists, a psychologist, and he was practicing in the 1960s or so. He came up with this idea of the fully functioning person. And he said that the fully functioning person lives in harmony with his or her deepest feelings and impulses. So we're very self-aware. We know our bad impulses, we know our good impulses, and we're comfortable with that. We're comfortable with who we are. And he says that's where we want to get, that's where we want to be. That's healthy personality growth, is where we're accepting of who we are and happy with who we are, and aware that not everything about us is perfect, but that's okay, and that we're okay with that. He came up with the idea that we have three different aspects of our personality. We have our self-image, how we see ourselves, our ideal self, who we want to be, and then our true self or real self, which is how other people actually see us. And what he said is that the closer those are together, the more similar those things are, the better we feel about ourselves and the more fully functioning we are. Carl Rogers also came up with the idea of unconditional positive regard. I think we'll talk about him in the treatment section of the last two chapters on psychological disorders. But he was a really warm person, and he believed that we could all be the best human being we can be, just kind of like Maslow as well. And so he said that, uh, having congruence between these three aspects is really what we're looking for. So what he said was our ideal self is who we want to be, and we often beat ourselves up because we're not who we want to be yet. And if you think about it, you're here in college, you're not where you want to be in life 100%. But hopefully you're where you need to be in life right now. You're a college student, you're working hard, you've got other aspects of your life that are important, and you can't achieve all your goals, your future goals now, but you're working towards those, and that should be your ideal self. But a lot of times we think about what we should be and how we should be 10 years from now, and sort of beat ourselves up for not being there yet. And that's what Carl Rogers said. So how do you see yourself? And some people see themselves more negatively than they need to be. Of course, there's a minority of people that see themselves as better than they really are, but most of us are pretty self-deprecating, and we're pretty hard on ourselves. And so we tend to beat ourselves up with that ideal self. And then the true self is who you really are, how other people see you, and often other people see us as better than we see ourselves. So really what Carl Roger was saying is that we want all these things to be incongruent, so that we feel happy with who we are, and that we're aware of who we are and how other people see us, and that we see ourselves accurately, and we're accepting of that, and recognizing that, yeah, we have these ideals and these goals for later, for the future, and we're working towards those. We don't have to be there yet. So that was the humanistic theories and Carl Rogers' theory of personality development. And now trait theorists came along and they wanted to really accurately describe somebody's personality. And they felt like we could accurately describe somebody's personality through personality traits that are unique to that particular individual. And that if we could describe those traits, then we can actually predict somebody's behavior in certain situations. So traits are relatively stable aspects of a person that describe that person's personality. Here are some traits that Raymond Cattell was one of the first trait theorist in psychology, and he came up with 16 personality factors that he felt could describe somebody's personality. And now we're down to the big five, which is only five personality traits to describe somebody's personality. So 16 is a lot. But these are traits that have been identified that really can accurately describe somebody's personality. We don't use this test that much anymore, but it was one of the first tests. And if you think about it, some of these serious, happy-go-lucky, conservative, experimental, self-sufficient, dependent, disciplined, controlled. Oh, that's undisciplined. I was going to say that sounds like the same thing. So these definitely could tell you a lot about a person if you had the ratings on that. Hans and Sybil Eysenck came up with 4 different personality types. That are not really used today, but they were certainly one of the first attempts to try to describe personality with traits. And they came up with these 4 different personality types. They also came up with 4 different things that they called unstable or stable, introverted or extroverted. Some theorists, I think Carl Jung, thought we could just describe somebody's personality as either introverted or extroverted, but that seems too simple. It doesn't really give us enough information. So certainly a lot of these traits are certainly could give us a lot of information about a person. But the Big Five personality test was developed in 1987 by McCrae and Costa, and they came up with 5 basic dimensions of personality that they really felt could comprehensively describe somebody's personality. So you're going to take this test for your homework assignment, and then really think about, how well does this describe your personality? I can't remember how many questions it is, but it's not really long. It doesn't take that long, and it really gives us a good picture of your personality. And you guys probably don't remember, but there was a Facebook scandal, probably 5, 10 years ago now, where Cambridge Analytical was a company that wanted to, it was actually a university, and they were saying that they wanted to use a personality test to assess people's personality and do research basically on this. And they actually used the Big Five personality test. And what they did, and the reason why it was a scandal, is that when you went onto Facebook, and I know a lot of you don't use Facebook anymore, but we could say Instagram or something else today, it would pop up and say, hey, what's your personality? Take this test. And what they did was they gave the people this Big Five personality test, and then they sold that information along with all your personal information too. But not only did they have all your name and address and phone number and date of birth, but now they also know what your personality is like. And so if you're a person that is extroverted and open to really new experiences, you're adventurous, they're going to start sending you stuff for people that are more adventurous, right? And so they're going to tailor that advertising now to your personality profile. And people innocently took that test thinking, it was just a fun test. But really what it was an attempt, and actually, I shouldn't even say attempt, because they actually did take these people's information, and now it's out there for anybody else to advertise to, and it's really a pretty accurate description of somebody's personality. It's the most influential trait theory. It's the one that we use today, and it's the most useful. So these are the 5 personality dimensions that you will get on the Big Five test. And you do want to remember all 5 of these. This down here, the ocean or the canoe, these are acronyms to help you remember the 5 different traits or dimensions. So O would be openness to experience, C would be conscientiousness, E would be extroversion, A would be agreeableness, and N would be neuroticism. So we know what extroversion is, we know what agreeableness is. Conscientiousness is kind of how responsible a person is. Neuroticism is a really old term that was kind of a Freudian term, but anxious, worry. is what they're talking about when they're talking about neuroticism. And then openness to experience, how adventurous you are. So when you actually take the Big Five personality test, you will get scores on these 5 dimensions. And this is what it means if you have a low score or a high score. Um, so if you're open, if you're low on openness, that means you're really practical and conventional and boring, I guess. I'd probably score it low on this one. But if you're open to new experiences, you're going to be curious and have lots of interests. Conscientiousness is, if you have a high score, you're hardworking, you're dependable, you're organized. If you're low on that, you're impulsive, careless, disorganized. So in neuroticism, so if you're low on neuroticism, that means you're calm, you're even tempered, you're laid back, basically. And then if you have a high score, you're anxious and unhappy. So kind of interesting. So the Big Five personality test is a really interesting and useful test. Myers-Briggs is also a really useful test. Many of you may have already taken it. It's used, I think, by our career counseling department, and it's used by most, I believe. It gives you a pretty in-depth picture of your personality. It's kind of, I always have found it a little bit confusing to try to interpret what it means. I think the Big Five is a little bit more straightforward, a little bit simpler, but the Myers-Briggs gives you a little more in-depth view of your personality. So if you ever took it, these are kind of the basic dimensions that they rate your personality on, and and they pick out the top 4 that you score the highest in. So it's interesting and it's a useful test to really get an aspect of your personality. I think the thing that was confusing, I think, to most people is, their description of what does it mean to be sensing or intuition or thinking, judgment and perception. These are all a little bit tricky. And so really understanding the descriptions can be tricky, I think, on the Myers-Briggs, but it's still a really comprehensive test and a really useful test. And it's definitely a much longer test than the Big Five test. But these are different personality assessments that have been developed. And the reason they were developed is really to help people become self-aware, understand their own personality traits, and change those traits if they want to change those traits. And they're still really useful and helpful today. And I think, a lot of times students don't think they're so helpful because people are so much more self-aware today than they used to be. And part of the reason is because of these tests. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about some of the more sophisticated personality assessments. I'm going to talk about the MMPI and some of the projective personality tests, the ink blot test and stuff that's kind of fun. So thank you for listening.